Thoughtsqueeze Podcast. I'm here with fellow RC champion and Pro Tour crusher, requalifier, Jordan Selesnick, talking about his new released guide. Jordan, how are you doing?
Thank you, Richard. What an intro. I'm doing wonderful. I've had a lovely day. Have had really nice time at the PT. Back in New York City now, all relaxed. Everything's calmed down, and can't wait to talk a little bit about zoo.
Yeah, let's go with it. So you played Zoo at the PT, and not just Zoo. You played a very particular type of Zoo. This was the deck you played at the PT, and how did you do?
Um, so yeah, this is a little bit of a different list. I did test with Worldly Counsel for this pro tour, and it's kind of a funny story because we started off, analyzing the metagame a couple weeks out, and we were expecting a lot of Affinity, Boros, and Brood Scale as some of the top decks. And we wanted to find a deck that we felt like was decently well positioned into all of those. And we kept coming back to a pair of what are typically sideboard cards. You'll see some in the main deck of this list. And that is Wrath of the Skies and Consign to Memory. Because they hit a lot of the different kind of key gatekeepers in the format, and we had been experimenting with Zoo a ton. At the start, I believe it was like maybe six of us were into the archetype and we're testing it a bit. As the days went on and some people get, the PT scaries the week leading up, not everyone stuck with it, and it ended up just being me and my teammate and friend Krishna Pai who registered this exact same 75.
Yeah, and as far as I'm aware, you two crushed it. I don't know exactly your constructed record, but what was your combined constructed record? I know you both finished 10-6, right?
Yeah, we did. So it's funny. I started off 2-3. Krista started off 3-2 on day one, and then we both 5-0'd Modern on day two, putting us at a total of 15-5, 75% win rate with this list. What I'm very, very happy with. So yeah, I feel like we did kind of
Yeah.
crush it.
So if anything, that's just better for your choice. Like, obviously, it sucks doing bad at limited, but for your constructed portion in particular, it means that this deck was a good choice. And compared to just regular Domain Zoo, the other lists that weren't running Frog, more of these blue cards, and some weren't even running Wrath, there was a couple different versions that we'll talk about in a little bit. What do you think made this deck with these specific cards that we'll get to a good choice for the meta? And if you go to the next slide, there should be a little bit of, yeah, exactly. So here was the meta game in terms of percentages, and then the following you'll have the win rates as well. So yeah, what made it a
Yeah.
great choice?
Yeah. So we can go back and look at just the deck list here, and I can talk about that.
Yeah, of course.
So one of the weird things about Zoo is it's an archetype that is really defined by just a pair of cards. It's really just Leyline of the Guild Pack and Scion of Draco has been the fundamental pieces of Zoo and that kind of domain name. Even though many of the lists that were classified as Zoo at the PT and even beforehand for the last like 2 years end up looking really different from each other. So the kind of evolution of this deck is before the banning of Flage, the Zoo lists were really focused around Flage, and that led them to playing the card Doorkeeper Thrall as a way to kind of scam the Flage into play by it not being sacrificed to its escape trigger. And that was the kind of like the mainstay for the archetype. But after the banning, a lot of Zoo players kind of wanted to stick with that same structure of using Thrall, but they just swapped out the Flages for Croxa
Yeah.
and Null Drifter. And I'd say that those were kind of like the stock lists of Zoo. But what we realized about those lists is while they were able to play Wrath the Skies and Consign, as I mentioned, what I think the two most impactful interactive spells in the metagame, what they kind of lacked was closing speed and intrinsic power. And what I mean by that is that the The zoo decks are somewhat low resource in a way where you're not like drawing a ton of cards all the time and you're not seeing a ton of cards.
Yeah.
So to have the two card combo of Doorkeeper, Thrall, and Croxa, it requires you to, have drawn both of them and have the mana together and all of that. So while we kind of liked the Leyline Scion package for some reasons I'll get into in just a second, we wanted all of our threats to be just standalone really good creatures that our opponents kind of had to interact with, or else they'd run away with the game. So we kind of eschewed that combo that needed each other. Instead, replaced that with Psychic Frog and I mean some lists had Quantum Riddler as well, but really Psychic Frog and Riddler as the two kind of main additions there. So I'd say that was like one of the biggest differentiators, and the other one connected to the closing speed point is the addition of Practiced Offense, where this card, if you're not familiar, is quite the combo with Psychic Frog, where it's able to deal close to lethal damage if you have a frog on 2 and you discard your hand for an offense on turn 3.
It's lethal on 3, right? So
yes,
you can explain the combo there.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically what you can do is if you keep a hand of 7 and you're on the play, you're able to, play your frog on 2, and on turn 3, discard your entire hand, including a Practiced Offense, and use your 2 lands to flash back the Practiced Offense to give your frog double strike. You can then use those other cards you discard to give it flying. And then when you attack in, you'll get in. It'll be an 8 power frog. You'll have 8 for the first hit. You'll draw a card on first strike damage, and then can discard that last card to have 9, totaling 17 damage. And in a format with where fetch shocking, getting you down to 17 is very, very common on turn 1. This is oftentimes lethal damage.
Yeah. In addition to just Psychic Frog being able to combo kill like that, even having it with 4 cards in hand is often enough to get you over the finish line when you have Ragavan and these big chunky attackers. Like, did you find like just a couple of attacks, like getting them down to 10 life was often significant enough that it made your top decks much more live to pushing through the final points of damage? That the card made it worth it. It is a little bit of a lower power level card on rate. Is that something you regret, or was playing this white splash for offense worth it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I'd say that to the point of like how often are we actually doing this and killing our opponents on turn 3? Honestly, pretty rarely. It is more like what you described of just getting in a big chunk as a tempo swing. But I think what the card does is it creates the threat of dying out of nowhere. When your opponents see the Practiced Offense, obviously the Pro Tour is an open decklist environment, but as the deck proliferates and people are expecting offense, it forces your opponent to either interact with your frog on turn 2 or speed up their own clock. Because they might just be dead the next turn if they let you untap. So some of the main benefits there is that kind of like psychological side of things where some of your combo opponents are going to feel like they have to go for it because they might just be dead if you untap and offense them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I also just want to say, I think Riddler works really well in this structure of deck where you're mulliganing very aggressively for Scion of Draco, whereas the Croxa versions had that other like combo element. I think really Scion plus Leyline is much stronger in this style of deck, and in specific matchups where you need that, being able to refill your hand is worthwhile.
Yes, yeah, it totally is. I mean, it's funny, like when you're playing Leyline of the Guildback, you're already down to, one fewer card in your opening hand when you start with it on play. It's easier to empty your hand with the Riddler there, and you kind of need that little bit of card advantage. We've also seen Quantum Riddler and Psychic Frog be best friends in other Esper shells in the past. And the same thing is true here, where you're able to discard down when your Quantum Riddler ETB triggers on on the stack, draw some extra cards. Same thing with the frog damage trigger. So it just works really nicely in a deck that like wants to mulligan for its Leyline Scion hands, that is generally deploying a lot of its threats and even interactive spells pretty proactively. That Riddler is just a really nice refuel button, on top of being a 4/6 flyer, which works really, really well with practiced offense when you can give it double strike a little bit later in the game.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's worth pointing out that like this style of deck is very different than the Croc set. Like those small differences make a big effect in sort of how you can shape your game plans. You can see, I think, like one or two slides on. We have the next highest domain zoo list. So you and Krishna both finished 10-6. And then the next highest domain zoo list. This is the PT list of Marco Camiluzzi. Hope I'm pronouncing that last name correctly. But you have the Croxa Doorkeeper Thrall. The mana is probably a little bit better. Would you agree with that? Like Psychic Frog on Kavu, I remember being very scared when I saw this. I guess this version is running Pest Control as well, but that can cycle. But I think you ultimately came to the conclusion that that downside was worth it, and it seemed to pay off.
Yes.
Any other sort of like main differences between this version and yours that you wanted to comment on? Or is that mainly the...
No, honestly, I'd say that while the decks kind of look similar on paper, they function very, very differently. That, like, yeah, like there is some archetype overlap, but the actual play patterns are quite different. So you mentioned the mana base. That is an interesting element where, another relic from the Flage days in Zoo, they are playing 2 Arena of Glories in this list. And they also, given the fact that they need to escape Kroxa, want basically all of their lands to tap for red or black, and the ones that don't are taxed pretty heavily. You'll see that they only have 2 lands, I believe, that don't, the one Temple Gardens and the basic plains. So they're very focused on the black and red, which makes them a slightly worse counterspell deck. They're playing 3 stubs instead of our 4. They do have the 1 consign in the main, but we are at a total of, I believe, 14 counter spells in our 75, if I remember correctly. 12 counter spells. So we really focus on the untapped blue early on, whereas this list is less into that. So yeah, I'd say the kind of Kroxa thing leads you down a different path structurally with mana, but it also leads you to want to close the game out a little bit faster, whereas the Quantum Riddler and the Psychic Frog can extend the game a little bit more, especially when paired with our key interactive spells.
Very interesting. Okay. We talked about the main game plans here. What specifically are you looking for in your opening hand? And I guess the next main modern event is open deck list. It's going to be the RC season because the RCQ season is just coming to a close. But just generically, what are the main plans of this? We talked about Psychic Frog plus practice offense. We talked about Scion plus Leyline. What other types of hands are you looking for? And then we can get into the matchup specific things.
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say one of the things to note about this list compared to previous ones is that I'd say traditionally a lot of domain zoo decks want to fetch their Triome on turn 1 when they don't have Leyline, and then match that with the Shockland on turn 2 that gives them full domain. In our case, that's Indatha Triome plus Steam Vents, so that you can cast your Scion on turn 2. However, with the current state of Modern and the speed of Affinity, of Boros, of Broodscale, of Storm, I am a very, very strong proponent of using all of your mana on the first 2 and hopefully 3 turns of the game with this deck. Okay. And that means that you're often going to be shocking on turn 1. You'll see we have a total of 11 1-mana spells that we can play, and if you add the hands that we do have Leyline, it goes up to 15 with Leyline Binding as well. So I want to be ideally casting a Ragavan on turn 1. Most of the hands that we do have Ragavan are often keeps, just because he's able to put on the pressure, fix your mana a little bit, and that he's kind of challenging to kill, interestingly enough, in the current metagame. So hands that you have... Yeah. There's really not. It's really against Boros Energy is when he's at its worst,
Yeah.
and Prowess too, where he doesn't get in. But against most of the other decks, they actually don't play a ton of cheap interaction or blockers for him. So he really just like helps you. Smooth out your mana a little bit and put on that early pressure, especially when backed up by disruption. But I'm going to be mulliganing hands a lot of the time that don't do anything on turn one, or at least don't have the possibility of doing something on turn one, like holding up a stub. Especially on the draw, like hands that are just like Kavu frog hands. Without that, are just going to be a lot. They're going to be pretty middling compared against what a lot of the other meta decks are doing. So. Yeah, so I prioritize being mana efficient on the first two turns, and it is crucial to have at least one threat. I'd say ideally two. This deck kind of like falls into the schema of what some people like to call Delver style decks, where you're able to land a really impactful threat that is going to put on a lot of pressure, and then you just hold up interaction for the rest of the game. And that's what you want to be doing here. You want to be playing your Ragavan, your Frog, your Kavu, or your Scions, and there's holding up Stub, Leyline Binding, Fatal Push, as the game progresses. So any hand that's just all reactive without the pressure isn't going to work. And some of the hands that are all pressure without the reactive spells are going to be worse too. However, I will give a quick caveat that the Frog and the Kavu are pretty good at finding those interactive spells with their Rummage and card draw abilities. So those I'm a little bit more lenient on when that's your only threat, but basically you really need to fit that threat plus disruption formula.
Yeah, especially if like you're on the play and that 2 mana play has a high likelihood of being able to attack and get in, draw a card, or lose.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's true.
I think that's a good point to talk about some of these hands. The first hand I'll talk about should be on the next slide. This hand. So first off, for those listening, it's a Thundering Falls and Meticulous Archive. So 2 of the surveil lands, not the best. You have a Polluted Delta, but you have a ley line to fix it. You have Ragavan as a great turn 1 threat. Riddler, which do you really consider as like a 2-mana threat? Probably not, right? And then you have Stubborn Denial to protect it. So in my mind, what would the curve out look like here in terms of playing it? You'd get Leyline down, start on a Ragavan with the Polluted Delta, and ride it to victory with Stubborn Denial. Would you keep this on the play? Is this worthwhile? It seems a little bit lackluster. Are you trying to shoot for better?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So this hand is super close to me. The fact that you have both of the surveil lands is quite unfortunate. That means that the curve out element is a little bit disrupted. I'll say that one of the best play patterns with this deck, and a way to use your mana effectively on turns 1 and 2 is you play your Ragavan turn 1, it gets in, then you have your treasure up, and you're able to play a 2-mana spell on turn 2 while holding up that treasure for just the 1 mana for your Stubborn Denials, your Fatal Pushes, yada yada. And this hand is close to being able to do that, but it is missing some of the key pieces where Riddler in a hand that has 3 lands and 2 of them are tapped is kind of high when you're not able to dump out the rest of what you want to do. And the Stubborn Denial is not turned on by the Ragavan. He's only a 2/1. He does not get the Ferocious trigger. And while you can definitely snag a Weapons Manufacturing or a Goblin Bombardment on turn 2 with the Stubborn Denial, it's not super reliable. If one of those surveil lands had been an untapped land of any sort, I'd be a lot more open to keeping this so you could warp your Riddler onto and hold up Stub. But the way that it's currently structured is you'd have to play the Rag on 1. On 2, if you don't draw an untapped land, you have to then play a tap land. And if you want to spend your Riddler, then you're spending your treasure and you're no longer holding up Stub, which makes me feel like while this hand looks solid on its surface, it would probably be a mulligan for me.
Yeah. I think I agree. Just thinking about in the blind, a quarter of the time, roughly, even more based on recent data, you're going to face Boros and Affinity. And while Ragavan seems to actually be better than I would imagine versus Affinity. Like, if your Ragavan gets removed or gets, blocked by an Ocelot Pride, this hand really struggles, right?
Yes, yeah. I certainly agree. And as I feel like this is the type of hand that gets a lot better or more or clearer in an open deck list environment where you're just going to know the matchups in which Ragavan is good. And in my mind, that's basically every deck except for Boros and Prowess. Surprisingly, the way that a lot of the affinity decks were constructed going into the PT was that they had no removal spells in their main deck, and the way that they generate creatures on turn one is most often through Pinnacle Emissary and then warping it out and then getting a lot of drone tokens, which notably can only block creatures with flying. So it's not typical that they have blockers for your Ragavan until turns 2 or 3 when they can deploy Kappa and use Urza Saga. So because of that, I would actually be somewhat more inclined to keep this if you're on the play against Affinity. But on the draw, it's likely too slow. And just in the blind, this hand running into Boros is kind of a nightmare. So I would be a little bit more hesitant there.
Yeah, makes sense. For the next hand, it's a little bit different. We have 3 lands, one of which Thundering Falls is to Surveil. We have a Flooded Strand and an Arid Mesa. We have Fatal Push as an answer, another Ragavan, and then we have 2 Kavus. So this hand, no Leyline for fixing, but you do have 2 fetches. This is just the question of, is a typical mid-range of, let's say you're on the play, Ragavan into Kavu, good enough to keep, given that looting factor, and you have an additional... one that you can cast on turn 3 if it gets removed. And specifically, if you're going to keep, how are you sequencing your fetches here? So that would be my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And in short, the answer is absolutely. I'm very happy to keep this hand. This hand does use all of its mana on the first 2 turns and probably third turn of the game as well, with 2 Kavus. And it just does exactly what we want. We're able to put on a ton of power and toughness on the board in these first 2 turns, especially if we're on the play by getting a Ragavan down into a Kavu, which we can make a 5/5 by the time it needs to attack on turn 3. And we usually in these spots want to just be able to rummage and dig towards typically Stubborn Denial and Leyline Binding as our ways to answer a lot of the pesky cards in the format. And with 2 Kavus, we do a pretty good job at that. And even with just the 1, it's meaningful pressure there. And then also the Fatal Push. That can be really frustrating for a lot of decks in the format. It's quite good at disrupting the Brood Scale combo. It's, of course, good against Energy, killing, basically all of their threats, and even against Affinity when we're on the play, being able to Fatal Push a warped Pinnacle Emissary can go a long way too. So that's a very valuable interactive spell to have here, and I'd be super happy to keep this. As far as the sequencing of the fetch lands, that is one of the things that you will learn as you play this deck, because there's a couple of patterns that become normal, and you need to kind of figure out where to deviate based on what you have. So with this hand, we'll see that we have 2 fetch lands and a Thundering Falls. With the Thundering Falls in our hand, we know that we need to be able to get the Abzan colors to be able to max out on our domain. And because we want to play the Kavu on 2, we'd really ideally have that Kavu be a 5/5 on turn 3, which means on those first 2 turns, we want to be able to get those Abzan colors while still being able to cast our Ragavan and our Kavu. So what that means here is that we're going to have to lead on the Arid Mesa to fetch a Blood Crypt, the black-red shock land. We can cast the Fatal Push, but really so we can get that Ragavan down. And then on turn 2, we're going to use the Flooded Strand to grab a Temple Garden, which would fill out those Abzan colors so that on turn 3 we can have the Thundering Falls and get our full domain there.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think the Fatal Push in this hand makes this hand great on the draw as well. Because you're able to play Ragavan off Blood Crypt on 1, and then turn 2, if there's let's say a must kill, like if a player plays a psychic frog or just something you really need to push, you can push Ragavan and then still Kavu. Like, you
Yes,
know,
exactly. Yeah, and that's the value of getting the blood crypt there too, where I mentioned this earlier, but a lot of the domain decks, you're often thinking about what your domain pair is, which is your Triome plus the Shockland that gives you all five land types.
yeah,
And here it is, it's Steam Vents and Endatha Triome.
yeah,
So because of that, the kind of like modal thing that you do is fetch for a Steam Vents in these early turns of the game. But this is one of those hands where you need to like stop and think for a second, noticing that you already have the Thundering Falls in your hand, and that there's a pretty high possibility that you need to push so your Ragavan can get in before you play your Kavu,
yeah,
which makes this a Blood Crypt fetch here. But you definitely just need to kind of keep those things in mind as you play with the deck, because mis-sequencing your fetches and getting the wrong land can be pretty detrimental to being able to curve out successfully.
yeah, absolutely. I think that was the most important thing about this hand. It also showed like Blood Crypt is very good in this deck for exact hands like this. The final
Yes,
question I have
yes.
about this, let's say you're keeping 6. What do you put back? Do you put back the Kavu or do you put back a land? And if so, which one?
Uh, so I am definitely putting back Thundering Falls in this hand.
Okay.
I think that the surveil lands obviously give a lot of utility. It's modern. We want to be able to fetch for them as utility lands. But as I mentioned earlier, we just really, really want to use all of our mana efficiently in the early turns of the game. And sometimes a tap land can really hold you back from doing that.
Yeah.
And it can have the biggest downside. Where with our Kavu and with the Ragavan and a way to clear the way for the Ragavan to connect in the Fatal Push, I think that we're going to have solid access to mana. We can get the treasures off the rag, and we can rummage away any other spells that we draw for our lands with the Kavu. That I think it's much worse for us if we end up having to play this tap land and can't curve out, or that we maybe even end up flooding. And I think that the Thundering Falls is just a clear putback for that reason.
Okay. Yeah, this is very helpful. Let's talk about the final, like just generic hand of what to keep. So this is Steam Vents and Hollowed Fountain, plus Scion, a Ragavan and Wrath of the Skies, which is a little bit of a nombo in the deck,
Yeah,
Stubborn
yeah.
Denial, and a Psychic Frog. So you can see this is a little bit of the mana base issues, but you do have a powerful start with Ragavan that you can then protect with Stubborn Denial. And if Ragavan connects, you can, you know, I think if you can guarantee that Ragavan connects, this is a good hand. Um,
Yeah.
but it's risky otherwise. What are you thinking about in this scenario?
God, yeah, this hand is one of those hands that really make you love and make you hate this deck. Where these shock pairings can be a little bit awkward sometimes. Obviously, we much prefer to have fetch lands, so we're able to make everything come together. But sometimes you do just draw the shock lands instead. But yeah, the thing that I'll say about this hand is, I mean, like the others, and like you'll find in a lot of modern, it is very matchup dependent and relies really heavily on your Ragavan surviving and
Yeah.
connecting. There are some matchups in which Ragavan is guaranteed almost to do that, like against Tron, or some other combo decks, and in those situations, if we're specifically on the play, I could convince myself that it's okay, given that just one fetch land would give us full domain, with the big caveat that the two shock lands that we have are Jeskai ones. We've got Steam Vents and Hollowed Fountain,
Yeah.
meaning that we're missing black-green. And our deck actually does not run Overgrown Tomb. The only way to get black-green is to fetch our Endatha Triome, our Triome, of course. And that's not really ideal because that stops us from being able to curve out.
Yeah.
So because of that, it really makes the mana in this hand super awkward. And I would be inclined to mulligan because we don't have double white for Wrath of the Skies. We don't have black for Psychic Frog. We don't have domain for Scion of Draco. All we really have is our Ragavan and our Stubborn Denial, which could maybe get there. But given that there's such a high ceiling of this deck with the Leyline Scion starts, and what have you. I don't think I'd want to risk it on something like this.
Exactly. I think the lesson of this is, again, going Leyline Scion, so few decks are able to effectively answer that. Really, the best way to do it is like race it in a combo that you can do better, particularly on 7, than keep somewhat sketchy hands, unless you have a threat that you're guaranteed is going to survive and connect. But that's matchup dependent, and not always guaranteed. So I think this was helpful. This talked about like these couple of hands sort of shaped the general philosophy of sort of how I think you were playing the deck. We'll get to some matchup specific things in a bit, but just lessons that I sort of picked up on. One, you're not always doing the Triome plus Steam Vents as like your always go-to fetches. Sometimes you have to be careful about what you fetch when you have early plays. 2, you value threats over pretty much everything else on the blind, unless you know specific answers are going to be good. And in this case, don't settle for mediocrity, particularly on 7, with your mana base, given that this deck has such a high ceiling. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, or do you disagree with anything that I said there?
No, I think that's a really great summary, Richard. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it's true. And some of these hands, you'll see these very potent cards in certain matchups, like Wrath of the Skies,
Yeah.
which we should get into a little bit more soon. And that can be attractive if you know you're playing against the right matchup for it. But generally, I think thinking about the mana, thinking about using the efficiency in those early turns is the crucial thing.
Yeah, exactly. Let's then get into, now that we have sort of like an overview of the deck as a whole and why you came into it, let's get into specific matchups. So the first is this is, yeah, you're going to keep it on that hand. We'll talk about that in a second. But
Yeah.
generically, you have a sideboard guide out that goes through each matchup. But generically, how does the game shape post board? Into the larger archetypes, into very fast decks, into decks that play to the board, and into decks that are a little bit more controlling, right? This deck is sort of has like a generic mid-rangey feel, and because you're playing all 5 colors, you have a lot of sideboard options, so you can tune it to a specific metagame. But what does the overarching structure of your boarding look like?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, one of the things that I mentioned at the jump is that this deck is incredible at being a threat plus disruption deck. Our threats are really, really resilient. Basically, all of our 2 drops dodge damage-based removals. Scion of Draco is uniquely positioned as a card that dodges, Kozilek's Command, Prismatic Ending, Fatal Push, basically everything there is. And because of that, we want to stick with that same type of formula by having the sticky, powerful threats that are hard to deal with, but just tuning our disruption so that it fits what we're playing against in the specific matchup. One of the nice things about the way this deck is constructed is that we have access, I mean, thanks to being 5 colors, to really like a lot of the best sideboard cards that exist in the metagame. And I'd say most of those are some of the best counter spells. So in the board, we've got our 4 Consign to Memory, 2 Mystical Dispute, and 2 Spell Snare on top of our 4 Stubborn Denial. So making sure that we have, the right mixture of those when the games slow down post board goes a really long way. And on top of that, you'll see just other interactive, disruptive pieces like Wear Tear and Obsidian Charmaw and Deafening Silence that all are pretty, some of them are reactive like the Wear Tear, but at least the Deafening Silence and the Charmaw can be proactive ways to disrupt our opponent efficiently while we're still able to hold up mana for those counter spells as the games go on.
Yeah, very interesting. So let's take an example of different types of decks. Boros was the most played deck at the Pro Tour. It didn't do that well this weekend. But let's sort of take that as an example as like a faster deck that plays the board. One where we're probably not the beatdown, right? We're probably going to have to employ some of those more protect the queen strategies or even like controlling strategies.
Yeah.
And let's imagine that this is our post-board hand versus Boros. If you are willing, what was sort of your board plan versus Boros in particular? You're welcome to share that. No pressure if you want to save that for the
No, I'm happy to.
Okay, there we
I'm
go.
I'm very very happy to share that. Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned it there. The thing with the Boros matchup is that we do kind of have to play the controlling role, just because they're able to play the board faster than we are. But we play that controlling role really quite well against them. We do have access to Leyline Scion, which is just really challenging for them to deal with. They only have typically 2 Thraben Charms and a Static Prison to get our Leyline off the battlefield before they actually would need to deal with the Scion. But really, just a 4/4 flying first strike vigilance lifelink hexproof body is just insane against them. Like, they just can't really race it effectively. They can't block it effectively. It just kills them. So that's definitely an angle that we like, and we want to mulligan towards, especially pre-board. But when it comes to post-board, we do end up having 3 Wrath the Skies in our 75, which means they are punished for playing to the board super early, and sometimes it gives us a little bit more time when they hold back, or when we're able to sweep it up. But yeah, this is an interesting hand that you show us, because typically against Boros, I just want to be reactive on the first, turn, sometimes 2 turns of the game, and then land one threat that functions almost just like a brick wall against them, because the Psychic Frog, it's just almost impossible for them to get off the battlefield with damage-based removal outside of having a Guide of Souls go crazy and make a bunch of energy for discharge. So it's hard for them to attack into that. Hard for them to attack into a 5/5 Kavu, and harder for them to attack into the 4/4 Scion. So I like to spend that first turn interacting, that second turn playing a threat, and then spend the mid game controlling the board, either with some more spot removal spells like Fatal Push, like Wrath of the Skysing for 1 if they've deployed Guide of Souls and Ocelot Pride, but eventually work my way up to being able to outcard them with a Quantum Riddler, to have that big flying body that, again, is hard for them to deal with, and ideally, one-shotting them with a practiced offense as the game goes late. This hand that you've shown here is kind of funny. I mean, it does 2 of those things well. It does the Fatal Push interacting on turn 1 and playing that hard to deal with threat on turn 2.
Just in case people are only listening, it's 3 fetches, 2 Flooded Strands, and an Arid Mesa, a Plains in hand. So 4 lands is pretty land heavy, but a Fatal Push, Psychic Frog, and a Wear Tear. So because we have the Plains, we have an answer to Blood Moon with Wear and Tear. We have Psychic Frog and a Fatal Push. We're really riding that to victory. What do you think?
Yeah. So it's nice that we can push on 1 and play the Frog on 2. Wear Tear. It is a sideboard card, but it is not an incredible sideboard card. We bring it in because oftentimes Boros decks will have 2, sometimes 3 Blood Moons, and we want to be able to get that off the battlefield using our basic planes. So the Tear side is really the relevant thing there. It does also nab Goblin Bombardment and Static Prison. However, we're typically a little less afraid of those, because Boros players will often wait to play the Bombardment until a little bit later in the game once they've developed their board. And at that point, we would hopefully have drawn into an answer, so having it in our opening hand is not as ideal. This hand is very close. I don't love it, but part of me is inclined to keep, because we're able to use that mana efficiently, and we can potentially draw into something with our Psychic Frog. But I'd say it's quite close.
Yeah, I think this hand is instructive in the sense of we do have almost a hammer versus them pre-board, which is Leyline Scion. Post-board, depending on the particular configuration of what Boros is playing, that plan is not unbeatable at certain times, right? They can play Wear Tear. Yeah. Yes, it takes a lot of resources, but if that's sort of like our whole plan is like mulligan to 5 to get there, they can beat a Leyline Scion post board. It's hard, but doable. Um, However, this hand is a little bit lackluster. I wish one of these lands was just any spell, and I'd feel better about it. And I honestly don't know what the answer is with this. It might take some play testing. I think the one positive thing I can say about it is that Static Prison is the most common answer out of their deck to Frog. Even in this hand, like, we're fine discarding 2 cards to Galvanic Discharge, and to protect it and sort of ride to victory. And having Tear, like, would you agree that cashing in Tear, if they Static Prison the Frog, like, that's an instant,
Oh yes,
yeah.
yes,
Well,
yeah.
like, you're not
You
saving it
definitely
for
do
one
that.
moon in this, especially since you have.
No, no,
Yeah.
yeah. And if they've used a resource to do that, it's great, especially because we can probably finagle a 2-for-1 out of that by doing it at instant speed and hopefully using our
Yeah.
frog to surprise block something.
So maybe this is a type of hand that you'd look at their list in particular, note how many answers they have to Frog, and then make your decision based on that and whether you're on the play or on the draw. Interestingly
Yeah.
enough, I think this hand's a little bit better on the play just because Psychic Frog is so good on the play. It gives them less of an opportunity to also go like, I don't know, like guide plus. Actually, I don't know. What do you think? Walk through. Is this better on the draw or better on the play?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it is better on the play.
Yeah.
Because the frog is going to be able to survive more often on the play because they won't have the chance to develop more energy
Yeah.
for discharge potentially. But really, it just like means that we're able to attack more often when we're on the play. And because we're a little bit land heavy here, I think that we really want to get the card draw out of Psychic Frog. Just draw into really just one more threat would be ideal. And being on the play just allows us to do that in a bit of a safer manner.
So no worries if it's really close. Do you have an answer to sort of, is this worth like mulliganing to try to find something better, or is this just good enough that you'd keep it and be a little bit hesitant about it?
I think on the play, I'd be open to keeping it, just because we use our mana really efficiently in those early turns and have a solid set of answers, albeit not amazing ones.
Yeah.
On the draw, I'd be a lot less inclined to do it, just because if we draw one more land with this hand, especially on the draw, it's just going to be so easy for us to fall pretty far behind,
Yeah.
and that can be a recipe to lose what is typically a really good matchup for us. So when we do have all of the tools in our deck to win this matchup, I think it's probably it's either our best or our second best matchup. In these types of situations, I wouldn't want to rely on just getting lucky and drawing the right set of cards off the top.
Yeah.
I'd rather just mulligan for a hand that actually is just executing on the thing that we want to do.
Yeah. Okay. I agree. Let's talk about a better hand. Let's talk about the next hand.
Sure. Ooh, look at this one.
Yeah. Pretty good, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, definitely.
Arid Mesa and Steam Vents. Note that with Arid Mesa facing Indatha Triumph, that gives us full domain. We have a Scion on 2. We can also cast a Psychic Frog on 2. We have 2 Leyline Bindings as answers, and we have a Practiced Offense as well. Hand is obviously great, right, Jordan? This would be an instant keep on 7 on the play or draw. Do you agree there?
Yes, I definitely agree there, and it's funny, and I think this is a really good one for us to talk about because it goes against that rule that I've been saying of just using all of your mana in
Yeah.
those first 2 turns. Because with this hand, there's nothing you can do on turn 1, and you can't even really surveil. I mean, you have to get the Indatha Triumph here so that your Scion of Draco and your Leyline Bindings can be fully powered up. But because we have the Psychic Frog Practiced Offense combo, it's just so potent that I'm really excited to keep this in this hand. And in particular, because we have the Scion to back it up as well.
Yes.
One of the nice things about Scion and Frog in this deck is that, it's great when Scion is with Leyline and can give all of the abilities. But the best 2 abilities, I'd say in the current metagame for racing and protecting, are the blue and the black abilities, which are Hexproof and Lifelink.
Yes.
So with this hand, you're able to, if you want, even deploy your Scion first, which is, very challenging to kill threat, as I previously mentioned, and then play the Frog after if you're playing against decks that are playing, say, Fatal Push.
Yeah.
If not, you can just deploy that frog first. If your opponent is fetched down and is tapped out to 17 or below, you can just go all in on the practiced offense combo. But if they haven't, if they have mana up, or if they're still at 20, you can then just play your Scion on turn 3 to give your frog hexproof and lifelink,
Yeah.
protect it for the next turn, so that you can go for it, and then use, if you draw another land, use that extra mana for a leyline binding. So while the efficiency isn't all here without having something to do with your first mana, the power certainly is, and it makes me very much inclined to keep.
Yeah, I agree. I think, this has very high upside. Now let's imagine we're on 6. What do you put back on 6? We have 2 nice answers, which specifically against Boros is very nice. But having 2 threats is also really important, as we've talked about before. Do we get rid of practice offense because it's kind of the worst on-rate card, specifically in the matchup, even though it has a little bit of combo potential with Frog here?
I actually kind of like keeping practiced offense in this hand,
Okay.
just because it's able to race them so effectively. Where our creatures, the frog and the scion, do a really good job at blanking some of their early threats. So I'm a little bit less worried about being run over by like an Ocelot Pride or a Ragavan. Guide of Souls can be a little bit more of a problem,
Yeah.
but those two are not so bad. Even Voice of Victory is not a huge worry with this hand. And what happens if we do have one of the threats being able to hold the ground down effectively, we can then just use our practiced offense as a way to just get a huge life linking hit,
Yeah.
either with the frog by double striking it, or even with your scion giving it life link at certain points too. Can be really nice against Boros to actually like play that kind of controlling game plan, brickwalling them and using some interaction for the first 4 turns of the game, and that when you get to turn 5, if you have a practiced offense, you can just cast
Yeah,
both
just
halves of it, and just, I mean, sometimes just kill them, but
Yeah.
even like say they remove your frog or something like that, if you just like do both modes on your Scion, you can just get in for 12 with, lifelink, a 6/6
Yeah.
flying lifelink double strike. And it's just so hard for them to race that. So it just kind of looms and sits there for a while. It's honestly, this is a very funny hand to show because in my second to last match, I played against a really good Boros player, and I had a practiced offense in my graveyard for like the majority of the game, and my only threat on the battlefield was a frog for the first several turns,
Yeah.
and it just like sat there threatening them in a way that made them play much more defensively themselves.
Absolutely.
And that's
Yeah.
another little added upside that you get, is that it creates this fear around it. They know that they can't tap out or go all in, and it buys you more time, so that you're able to then find your Rathus guys or just set up that frog practiced offense kill when you have a stubborn denial or spell snare to back it up.
Okay. So on 6, it sounds like you'd put back the binding. That is good to know, because that is not intuitive to me. On
Yeah.
5, you probably put back the offense, right? Because then it becomes
Yeah.
very resource light. But honestly, on
Yeah.
5, this is still a pretty good hand of Scion, Binding, Frog, and 2 lands. I'd take that.
Honestly, it's a pretty great 5. Like, I think that that 5 is going to beat Boros a lot of the time. They just have such a hard time dealing with these threats, and sometimes you just need that one interactive spell to get their Ajani or their bombardment off the battlefield, and then there's just not a ton they can do.
Yeah. Now, I think that does a good job of sort of explaining these fast matchups. We can transition to what, according to Frank Carson's data, was one of the more difficult problems for the deck, which was the Eldrazi decks. So both Brood Scale and whatchamacallit, just regular Eldrazi Tron were favored
Fight
via
Ringing.
the data into this deck. Now, granted, Frank Carson took all of Domain and put them together. And that's not necessarily it's favored into your version of the deck. And I'd imagine, given that your deck is all like, the practice offense combo, the Tron players might need to respect that more. Game 1, like the matchup might look a little bit different. But do you in general find that these slower matchups are the more difficult ones? And then we can talk about some of the hands there, how you board versus Eldrazi Tron in particular, I was thinking.
Yeah. So I'd say the first point I would note, at least about the data from this Pro Tour, is that you really do need to look at the domain stuff with a bit of a grain of salt because the domain lists look really different from each other.
Yeah.
And whether you're playing the Croxa Doorkeeper Throw build is going to be a huge determining factor into whether or not you're good into these Eldrazi and big mana decks. Same thing, the other build that we hadn't really mentioned is there's kind of an Esper focused domain build that's using Felia and
Yeah.
trying to blink your Quantum Riddlers with Felia. And I'd say both of those other builds are worse into the Tron decks because they just like simply don't put on as much pressure and their disruption just doesn't line up the same way. The Doorkeeper Throw, obviously not good against the cast triggers of the Eldrazi. So I do imagine that's like one of the big kind of negatives for those versions of the deck into those matchups. But
Just
when it comes to ours, sorry, what was that?
I was just gonna say, and just even like versus the blinking versions, like Felia Value Pile, really cool idea. Like the blinking is great, but historically has been really bad into just like Ugin,
Yes,
like it's
yes,
really hard to
exactly.
nickel and dime Eldrazi Tron. That historically has been a very very non-winning way to approach that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. So I'd say that yeah, the closing speed element is really important against
Yeah.
those decks. Yeah, what's nice about this being a mid range deck that having the whole pressure plus disruption thing is that the deck does do a good job at just like getting power and toughness into to play and just killing your opponent. So against those Eldrazi Tron decks and Brood Ragavan ends up being a really important card because it's able to just give you a mana advantage on the early turns of the game so that you can deploy your second threat while still holding up a Leyline Binding to take care of their Glaring Fleshraker. Against Broodscale, obviously, getting rid of the blade and the Broodscale itself is really important. And I'd say just like trying to put them off mana so that they don't have the time to set up is really big. So I want to be able to have Ragavan plus a 2-drop threat, Kavu, Frog, or Scion I'm happy with,
Yeah.
along with some disruptive spells. Mainly Leyline Binding and Stub can go a long way. Stubbing a Kozilek's Command is really, really important against those Eldrazi decks because that's the way that they can bridge themselves from the early game into the mid game and the late game.
Yeah.
So having an answer to that is something that I prioritize. But really, more than anything, it's just getting on board fast.
Okay. So let's then talk about both some example hands and then how you're boarding. Based
Yeah.
off your sideboard, it's sometimes just in general the games slow down post board. It's harder to board into a more aggressive version. So it
Mhm.
seems like based on your sideboard with Consign and what other I forgot. There was one other really good card versus them.
Yeah,
What was your
there's 4 Consign and 2 Obsidian Charmaw.
also, yeah, fantastic card. It seems less like this deck is about boarding into something either more aggressive or more getting on board. It's more just there are two cards, Charma and especially Consign, which are just so good versus them that increasing the density of those in your deck, like, just intrinsically makes you much better.
Yes, yes, that's exactly right. So, I think about the flex slots in this deck as the interactive spells for the most
Yeah.
part, namely the non-binding ones. Binding is just so versatile that I almost always keep them in. But the 3 Fatal Push and the 2 Wrath of the Skies are the cards that I think of as the kind of main flex slots there. And the reason that we chose those 5 in the main deck is just because those ones are great into Affinity, Boros, and Broodscale. So we wanted to maximize those. But really, yeah, swapping those 5 cards out. Or at least most of them. In this case, against the Eldrazi Tron decks, we cut certainly the Wrath of Skies. We actually only cut 2 Fatal Push. We leave 1 in because it's crucial to hit a Glaring Fleshraker. That's another
Yes.
way that they're able to bridge from the mid game to the late game. So we want to be able to have an answer for that. I like having the 4 bindings plus 1 push as 5 ways to deal with that in the mid game. And then we actually board out 2 Leyline of the Guild packs, which is something that I should talk about too, because I know that the headliner of this deck is of course having Leyline and Scion together.
I meant
Yeah,
that
go
Leyline
ahead.
Scion is just not as effective. Like a 4/4 lifelinking is great, but it doesn't really do that much versus Tron. Like, yes, it beats Boros, but Tron can sometimes just be like, I don't really care.
Yes, exactly. It goes way over the top of them.
Yeah.
Or way over the top of us, rather. So yeah, you'll see that in these matchups in which we don't really want to race. Like the lifelink element of the Leyline Scion package doesn't really matter that much. And the matchups in which our opponents don't have a ton of spot removal, the Leylines just don't really become that necessary for us to enact our game plan. The downside of drawing one in the mid game can be really bad. It can be a blank if we don't have a way to rummage it away. So I like to board out two ley lines in this matchup to be able to kind of hedge against that. Where having one in your opening hand and having that first copy can be nice because it just allows us to play our spells more efficiently, like our ley line bindings and such. But it's not the kind of end all that it is against Boros and Prowess and even Affinity. So I like to trim on those, and I really end up wanting to prioritize. I mean, as you mentioned, those sideboard cards, but I should really call out that Scion in particular is a phenomenal threat against the Tron decks, and that's because they don't have a way to kill it. Their Devourer of Destiny and their Ugins exile colored permanents. So Scion being colorless means it doesn't die to those, and the only way for them to really get it off the battlefield in most games is a Kozilek's command for 12, which if they're at that point of the game, you've got other problems. So it's really, really good at just dodging their early interaction. Sometimes they have dismembers, but not even every deck has those. Mulliganing to hands with Scion is great, particularly when you can go Scion into Frog, because then you utilize that hexproof, and then once you just have two sticky threats, you're able to really pressure them. All you need at that point is just like one Consign, one Stubborn Denial to keep them off balance, and you should be good.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. I think it's worth noting, when I mention E-Tron, I mean the non-fight rigging versions.
Yes.
Fight rigging versions, you probably do want to keep in your fatal pushes and maybe even like trim more into leyline binding, just because that combo element, like you'll probably want more interaction. But I'm sure
or trim leyline of the guild pack. But
yes, exactly.
No, that's exactly right. Interestingly, I kind of feel like the fight rigging version is almost a better matchup for us because we just like have a ton of tools for picking apart either half of their fight rigging combo. I mean, we have the fatal pushes and the bindings for the trudge, and then we have the stubborn denials and and the bindings again for the fight rigging. And if they're just left with one half of that pair, the cards look pretty bad. Because we just have a lot of versatile answers there, I feel pretty happy about that matchup.
That matchup's very interesting to sideboarding. I'm curious to how you'd think about it, but it might be like, so I'm just thinking off the top of my head is like Ragavan, great threat into Eldrazi as a whole, but very bad into Fanatic of Ronus, which I imagine those fight rigging players are going to focus on keeping. So thinking about how good Ragavan is and how good your removal is something I'll leave to the guide. I'll leave that to people who are going to play.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about E-Tron plans. If there should be another hand that we could talk about if you want to go this one. So this is post board after we took out the Wraths and some of the fatal pushes. We brought in Obsidian Charmaw and Consign. And this is a hand with no leyline, but has a Ragavan on one, a Flooded Strand, Temple Garden and Plains, and then we have the one of push, a leyline binding, and an Obsidian Charmaw. So Ragavan's obviously amazing in this matchup. Let's first talk about the easiest case, which I would say is 7 on the play, because that basically makes Ragavan as its best possible. What do you think of this hand in that scenario?
So 7 on the play is where I'm most happy to keep this hand.
Yes.
Yeah, that just gives us the ability to play the Ragavan on the play. Outside of, two Dismembers, typically, it's going to be very hard for them to get the Ragavan off the battlefield. And then once that Ragavan sticks, being able to cast Charm Maul becomes very realistic. If you just even on turn 3, you could cast it pretty reliably with just one treasure. So I like it there. One of the notes about this hand is that because we have the Fatal Push and the Ragavan, we want to be able to get Blood Crypt, but Flooded Strand is our one fetch that does not fetch Blood Crypt.
Yes.
So it makes our push much worse here. However, if we're still on the play, I think that should be fine. We can get Steam Vents, and we could still push off of the treasure if we want, but I think that more likely we would have the blue-red Steam Vents. We could shock in our Temple Garden green-white, which would be 4 types, and we could just cast Leyline Binding for 2 mana to get something off the battlefield if we need to, and then clear the way for Charm Maul on turn 3. So I'm fine with this hand on the play.
If they have Dismember, you probably lose a decent number of those games, but I think that's just a sacrifice you have to take, because for every game that you lose to dismembering your Ragavan, there's games where Ragavan just completely takes away and steals the game.
Yes, exactly.
Now, it's a little bit harder on the draw, because Ragavan has a little bit less chance of getting in, and like you might have mentioned, is like you still don't have double red for this Obsidian Charm off. You can't get a temple, or if you can't get a treasure, and you don't have black for Fatal Push, which at this point doesn't matter. Maybe they can establish a what's the Eldrazi that spawns another Eldrazi?
Fleshraker.
Yeah, Fleshraker on 2. What is your opinion of this on the draw?
Yeah, so this hand on the draw has a much higher fail rate. Yes. It's able to get bricked by by a Fleshraker, as you mentioned. Also, though, if they just have Eldrazi Temple and a K command, they can just K command your Ragavan on turn 2, which is so brutal. They also can play, some lists are playing Thought-Knot Seer. They can play that off of, an Ugin's Lab / Eldrazi Temple, having both of those. So there's just a lot of ways that your Ragavan either gets answered or doesn't get in on the draw. And because we're really reliant on the Ragavan for casting our Charm Maul and our push, I don't really love it there. So I think this is a mulligan on the draw.
Yep, I'm with you completely. That Kozilek's command on 1 is a very important play pattern that Eldrazi hands will mostly keep on the back of that play pattern, especially.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talk about the next hand, which I also think is pretty interesting. This is an Arid Mason, a Blue Delta, and a Plains. Again, I feel like the Plains have been popping up so much in these.
Yeah, the basic Plains sucks. I should quick call out on the basic Plains. Yeah. Yes, it sucks, but it's necessary. Yes. So I know that we're a deck that has a blue-black 2-drop, a green-red 2-drop, and that basic Plains really throws a wrench into both those. It is true, but the real reason that it's there is just because against Blood Moon, with basic Plains, we're able to cast our Leyline Bindings, as well as Wear Tear to blow up the Blood Moon, and that's just crucial because Boros, most popular deck in the meta, is playing a couple copies of that, and even Affinity has one in the sideboard. So we kind of need it for that. We end up not fetching for it that often, except for in those matchups, but sometimes it does make hands like these kind of awkward.
Yeah. I must say, I've specifically chosen these hands because they're close. Other than the one Frog PO hand, I wanted to at least have one with something cool. But I'm filtering through and being we have Leyline Scion. But
Yeah, of course.
So again, those are 3 lands, and then we have a very interesting threat base. No Ragavan, no 1 mana play, but 2 Scions, a Territorial Kavu, and a Consign. So multiple things to consider. 3 solid threats. You mentioned Scion's particularly good versus Eldrazi Tron. No 1 mana threat, though, but you also have Consign. Sort of difficult there. Yeah. You also have to really consider what you're fetching off of each of these lands based on the fact that you have basic Plains, and keeping up Consign can sometimes be difficult. For instance, you can't cast on 3 Territorial Kavu and then keep up Consign if these are the only 3 lands, right?
Yes, that's true.
How are you? Again, we'll go with the best case scenario. We'll go with on the play on 7.
Yeah. So this hand actually has like a couple different pathways that you can go down, which I think are pretty attractive. Where the Eldrazi Tron often wants to spend its early turns setting up with expedition maps, sometimes with a Flesh Raker, sometimes by playing a Talisman, all of these other all these ways to kind of just accelerate and smooth out their draws. I am perfectly fine consigning one of those cards early on if it means that I'm using my mana efficiently.
Yeah.
We do have a lot of other interaction in the deck with 3 more consigns, the Stubborn Denials, the Bindings, all those cards that we've mentioned before. So I don't think it's that bad to spend a consign early on something, even though maybe it's better sometimes when we'd rather save it for Kozilek's Command. I think in this hand you can consign on 1, and that's totally fine. So I'd say the 2 main pathways that you have here is that you play a fetch land on 1, and you either consign one of those plays if they have them, or you can fetch for a Triumph. If you fetch for a Triumph, you're able to play Scion on turn 2 by using your other fetch land to get Steam Vents. And then on turn 3, you can play your basic Plains and play yet another Scion holding up a blue mana that you would fetch from your Steam Vents. And that's really nice. So the possibility of playing Scion and then Scion with Consign backup is really nice.
Yes.
So that's one pathway, and the other pathway is where your opponent does play, a Talisman or what have you on turn 1, and you do need to consign that. Yeah. So there, you can fetch for a Steam Vents, consign it, and then on turn 2, you can then just play your Kavu by using your other fetch land.
Yes.
And getting a Temple Garden or what have you, and then use your Kavu to rummage. So in this case, I mean, ideally you have a green-black one.
Yeah.
You don't.
No,
what you
that's
can
fine.
do, yeah, exactly. What you can actually do, which is probably better, is you fetch for a breeding pool off of your polluted delta to consign, and then you can use your Arid Mesa to get a Blood Crypt, which can cast the Kavu on 2, and then use your basic planes to get full domain on 3. Yeah, and I think that pathway is perfectly fine as well. There you're using your mana efficiently, you're casting your threats, and while you prefer to lead with a Scion because it doesn't get K-commanded, Kavu is still very reasonable and a great play on 2 on the play.
Okay. What about on the draw? This hand's a little bit worse. Is it too slow?
Yeah, on the draw it's a little worse, but I still think it's a reasonable keep. In some ways, Consign is almost better for your turn 1 on the draw because then they are more likely to play their Flesh Raker, their Thought-Knot Seer, maybe even their Karn if they have a double Ugin's Lab hand. Yep. So you're going to get a more impactful spell with the Consign there. I'd say the biggest worry with this hand on the draw is if you play a fetch, hold up your Consign, your opponent doesn't cast anything of note on their turn 2, because then you want to tap out for your threat on your turn 2, but if that means you're doing that, then on their turn 3, they have a bunch of bangers that they can slam, like Ugin and Devourer. So while you can get maybe your Scion in play, which isn't going to die to them, it's still, if they have an Ugin on turn 3, is going to be brutal, and you just need a top deck of Leyline Binding, or else that card is just going to win the game on its own. Yeah. So you can get into a little bit of an awkward spot on the draw. However, I still think that these threats and this consigner are just good enough that I think I'd still be happy to keep it on 7.
Yeah, I think in that scenario you need to cast Scion. It's just and granted, the best E-Tron players will probably recognize, if I'm playing against you on Zoo and you don't play anything on 1, I'm like, all right, I'm expecting a Kavu, a Scion, a Frog. So if I have Kozilek's Command, I'm just going to hold it up. But you get really punished. If you just pass, I'll be like, great. You're applying no pressure to me. So you might just
yes, yeah.
and just saying, I hope.
No, I think you are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you are. I think you just have to play the Scion there. It's unfortunate. It shows the weakness of this hand,
Yeah.
but it also would require them to have had natural Tron because you didn't consign one of their setup pieces on turns 1 and 2,
Yep.
and sometimes that happens.
Yeah. Well, I think that is sort of a perfect overview of the deck. Um, I know you and Krishna have written a guide. Why don't you go and plug it for a second? Where can they find that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So yes, we have written a guide. It's awesome. It's super comprehensive. At this point, I think it's like 30 pages with evolution of the deck, matchup guides, mulligan strategies, trying to understand what your role is in each matchup, and go into just a lot of depth on how to pilot this deck because it certainly can be a tricky one. We are, members of Team Worldly Counsel. You can find it on our Metafy. We're going to be posting on Twitter later this week, so you can check us out at Worldly Counsel Heavy Play on Twitter, or just check out my own Twitter, Selesnick Jordan, just straight up, where I'll be posting it and talking about the deck too.
Cool. Yeah. And in a couple weeks, we might come back with a little bit more Domain Zoo content while people prepare for the RC. Hopefully, Krishna will be able to join, your teammate who helped put together the deck. Until then, what do you think the future of this deck will look like? Being in all 5 colors, you have a lot of options. It seems like the Boros style of decks and even Affinity did not do that well at the Pro Tour. Do you think that trend will stay and the deck will remain, or the format will remain to like hyper fast? Do you think the deck will have to adapt in any certain ways? What are you thinking? Just general thoughts there.
Yeah. So with the build that we have here, with the main deck Wrath Disguise and the Fatal Pushes and such, we were very focused on beating Affinity, Boros, Brood Scale as the 3 main decks that we expected.
Yeah.
And 2 of those decks did not have the best win rates, Affinity and Boros. Brood Scales was solid. It was not incredible. But we use those flex slots to focus on those. So I think based on those poor win rates, it's possible that there is a shift more towards some of the decks that did do well, which are namely Neoform and the Fight Rigging deck. And if that's the case, we just want to change up our interaction suite a little bit. Wrath Disguise is not particularly well positioned against either of those decks, so we might want to change those either for some more main deck counter spells that work out there, or maybe some other more flexible answers. So I'd say we can see shifts there. But overall, I'm really happy with this deck. I think the 75 that we put together is really, really nice and has a ton of coverage against these decks. I mentioned it in the guide and also a little bit here that I do like our Fight Rigging matchup. I also do like the Neoform matchup as well. I think that's close, but in our favor a bit. So I think that tuning those flex slots is going to be the main direction that you'll see if there are to be changes. But I'll also say this: people love to play Boros. They love to play Affinity. I don't. Yeah, even though they're 45% ish decks at the PT, like those decks are here to stay. This deck has an incredible matchup into both of them, and it's a strong reason to play it. And I think that sticking with a 75, at least in the coming weeks, is not a bad place to be.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, more Boros is just good for the deck because, again, that seems like a very favorable matchup.
Yes, yeah, it's one of our best. Boros and Prowess. Sometimes it feels like it's pretty hard to lose with this deck.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining me. I hope your guide goes well, and talk to you next time.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much, Rich.
Yep. Bye.